Okay, committee, we'll go ahead and start. And thank you all for coming. Even though we're kind of finished with our regular business, we still will have occasional meetings. So thank you for coming. And we are so happy today to have Kansas Board of Regents here to give us some great information on deferred maintenance. And I don't think, Chad, are you Chad? Yes, okay, so we'll get to meet you in a little bit, I'm assuming. So, okay, so the President, Blake Flanders, I'll just hand it over to you. And we will, if you'll leave some time for questions or whatever, committee, just be jotting down your questions and we'll make sure that we get those answered. So it's all yours. Thank you for coming. Welcome to Higher Ed Budget.
Yes, well, thank you, Chair Humphreys, and good afternoon. It's great to be in front of the committee, and again, we thank you for inviting us, and we appreciate this invitation to appear. I wanted to just let you know the Board of Regents is very committed to facility renewal and aligning our facility footprint to what we believe are going to be our current and future enrollments, and then also looking at how we can sustain facilities far into the future. I'm not going to speak very long because we have the expert here with us, and I just again would introduce Chad Bristow, who's our Director of Facilities, and really let him take you through some of the background. The board's completed a couple of really seminal studies that are going to really help the system move forward, and then has several policy positions that I think is going to build a structure where we can get this lifelong problem solved. So with that, I'll just turn it over to Chad.
Welcome, Chad. Thanks for coming.
All right. Thank you, Chair Humphreys and members of the committee.
Because we have people on that microphone, for some reason, if you have to kind of be right on it, and try not to turn your head too much, okay, or they won't be able to hear. So, okay. Yeah.
All right. Thanks for the tip. Okay. Very good. So is this? I can't really tell. Is it picking me up? Is that?
Jesse, can you hear? Okay.
Okay.
They're nodding yes. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Well, I think I understand that everybody has a hard copy of the slide presentation, but I also understand that it might be shared on the screen here too. So I've got just a few notes to share before we really get into those slides, but we'll definitely be tracking on those pages here shortly. Oh, there we go. All right. So, just before we get going, I mean, we hear and say deferred maintenance quite a bit, and I know just before we start, maybe we could sync up and make sure that we all understand deferred maintenance in the same way before we go through the update. So to understand deferred maintenance in the context that we use it, we've got to understand another term, annual maintenance. And what we usually mean when we say annual maintenance is a combination of about 3 different categories that we're all familiar with. We all live in buildings, work in buildings, so I think these will be familiar to you. But renewal and replacement of building components and systems is one of those facets of annual maintenance. That's replace a roof, replace an air handler or an HVAC split system, those kind of things. Pretty big ticket items. Routine maintenance, painting, caulking, tuck pointing, things of this nature is another component of annual maintenance. And then preventative maintenance, and think of more of replacement parts or adjustment, cleaning of equipment, those kind of things. So taken all together, that's annual maintenance. Those are the things we need to do to make sure our buildings are in good shape year by year, so we don't accrue deferred maintenance. Deferred maintenance is basically just that. It's annual maintenance that's postponed, delayed, deferred. And so I'll also point out that deferred maintenance is definitely not unique to Kansas, not unique to higher education. I mean, states all across the nation, organizations of all kinds struggle with this to match resources with the needs of their buildings, address deficiencies so they can support the the functions of the organizations that are housed in those buildings. So. And also point out, as everybody's probably aware, over the past 25 years or so, there have been attempts at various initiatives. Back in the 90s, there was what came to be known as crumbling classrooms, was a bond issuance that was repaid, I think, in 2012. That was in the 160s, 170s, 170 million or so. And then in 2004, legislative post-audit identified that there were more deferred maintenance needs, and so there was another initiative in 2007, the State Educational Long-Term Infrastructure Maintenance Program, and that was never fully realized. It's my understanding that it was not funded starting just a few years after, probably related to the Great Recession and those factors. So, over time, these attempts to get out in front of the problem of deferred maintenance have been made. Certainly progress, at the building level can be logged, but overall, there's still a significant deferred maintenance issue in the state university facilities. So the Board of Regents, starting in 2019, made a determined effort that a significant focus to address and solve the problem of deferred maintenance needed to be made. And in support of that, last year, 2 commission studies were undertaken and completed. One of them, a facilities condition assessment, was conducted by a company called Accruent. They basically surveyed and inspected about 500 buildings, evaluated the building systems in a very rigorous way. I'll just, as a point of reference here, their approach to assessing the condition of buildings and its components is a much more granular, detailed process than the processes that have been undertaken by university facilities teams in the past. In the past many years, and I think if you're familiar with the biennial legislative reports, you'll see the product of those audits. They're very useful in generally identifying the needs, quantifying, at a high level what the deferred maintenance liability is. But in this case, as we've worked with Accruent as a consultant, they have developed a facilities database that we now have for our use that just tracks hundreds and hundreds of building systems and components. I mean, it's an inventory system that is very, very detailed. And so the other study that was conducted alongside this was a space utilization study, and that was conducted by the architecture team of Gould Evans and their specialty consultant, higher ed specialty consultant, Rick's Associates. And they looked at about 280 buildings, basically all the buildings that had classes scheduled in instructional spaces in a snapshot during the fall of 2019. So that snapshot data from enrollment, class scheduling, personnel, HR, all of that information was taken from that point in time and utilized for the analysis that they conducted to determine how efficiently instructional spaces and office space were being utilized. I would also note that for the purposes of that study, even though it carried into 2020, it was determined that the implications of the pandemic were not going to influence the aspects of the study. So, for example, the social distancing in classrooms and all these various things that ensued were not influencing the data for this study. So I'll just also want to point out, too, that undertaking these studies over many months last year, it was very much a team effort. I mean, the universities, facilities teams worked with the consultants to make this possible. I mean, all the challenges of the pandemic. There were opportunities, right? Sometimes there weren't as many people in certain spaces, but there was a lot of coordination that went into that. So really appreciative that so much effort was made to make this possible. So as I started to mention, the culmination of these studies results in a database that ultimately will log every facility in the system. It tracks the data that identifies the condition of facilities. I mean, all the normal information, the size of a building, how many floors, what's its purpose, all those. But it also layers in the space utilization. So that's very unique to have a database that references efficiency, utilization spaces, as well as the condition of the physical components. And so one thing that we were able to do as soon as that was completed and that information was combined into this database at the end of last year is we referenced that data to issue the 2020 update. It's a report on State University building inventory, space utilization, and facilities condition. It's posted on the KBOR website for access if you haven't seen that. And it, for the first time, consolidates two reports, the biennially issued deferred maintenance and space utilization reports have typically been two reports every 2 years. This consolidates it into a three-part report. So finally getting to the slides here. So if you look at page 2 of the presentation, and this kind of tracks along the organizational structure of the report, if you've seen it or if you look at it. We're basically going to look at building inventory, space utilization, facilities condition, and then next steps for what the plan is to address deferred maintenance. So the building inventory, as you can see, all facilities in use across the system, there's approximately 1,100 facilities that are in use. And that includes several different categories of space: state-owned buildings that are managed by auxiliary enterprises, foundation and endowment-owned buildings, leased facilities. I mean, there's leased research spaces, various spaces that are leased, as well as public-private partnership projects that are leased from a private owner. I don't know if I'm getting too close to this, but I know it's a little. Okay. Okay. So I'll try to raise it up here in levels a little bit. No, thank you. I appreciate it. we can roll with it. Okay. So the 1,100 all facilities in use, if that makes sense. Then mission critical buildings. About half of all the facilities in use are categorized as mission critical, and that really means predominantly used for academic and research missions of the universities. And in this case, we're even including structures that are on research farms that basically serve the function to support research in those areas. So mission critical is about half of that, and then about half of that are mission critical and EBF eligible buildings. The Educational Building Fund, or EBF, is basically a 1 mil property tax levy for the benefit of the state universities. And I should also point out that in terms of EBF eligibility, the board guidance around how educational building funds are used for the university projects is narrower and more restrictive than the statutes that basically lay out the parameters of how that can be used. So we can get into that later too. So how old are all these buildings? What's the age of these facilities? Almost half of the state-owned buildings are 50 years of age or older, and 5% of those are over 100 years old. Page 4, how are these facilities used? More than half of all the facilities are currently used for academic and research purposes and for the spaces that support those functions. Page 5, we get into the total area and the replacement costs of those categories that we introduced there at the beginning of the building inventory. So for all the facilities in use, we're looking at 38 million square feet on approximately 28,000 acres. The estimated total replacement cost of the facilities is $10.6 billion. Now, total replacement cost, it really equates to what are the construction costs, the design costs, all the hard and soft costs to duplicate a building to serve the function that it currently performs. So all the costs. For the mission critical facilities group of buildings, we're looking at about 20 million square feet. Total replacement cost for all of those facilities together is estimated to be $6.9 billion. And then finally, that smaller subset of the mission critical, that are EBF eligible. We're looking at 17 million square feet. Estimated total replacement cost for those facilities is $5.4 billion. Now on the next page, just as a point of reference to try to kind of benchmark an industry standard that is basically a rule of thumb for determining the budget for annual maintenance. One way to do that, or one industry standard / rule of thumb, is to take the $5.4 billion. Let's look at the EBF. So for the total mission critical EBF eligible, we look at the total replacement cost. That's $5.4 billion. We take 2%. Now the rule of thumb is 2 to 4%, which encompasses a variety of building types. It could be different organizations. I mean, in this case, the Board of Regents has used conservatively a 2% investment for some studies. So if you took 2% of the $5.4 billion, you'd arrive at $108 million. And based on the square footage of facilities in this category, we saw 17 million on the previous page. You'd want to be investing that much in annual maintenance to stay level with your building condition year over year. And one thing to point out, the EBF revenue that is currently generated is in the $40 million mark. And even though that's significantly less than $108 million, the universities are supplementing that to some degree to the tune of millions. But you can see that it's still significantly less than the low end of the range rule of thumb for reinvesting in annual maintenance. So, over time, that just grows and grows and grows. So moving on to the space utilization study, I think I mentioned before, the scope of that study was about 277 buildings, 11 campuses. They're listed here and color-coded if you're looking at a color copy or the screen. And just to point out one more time, the study specifically looked at instructional space, so general purpose classrooms, specialized teaching labs, departmental classrooms, things like this, as well as office space in those buildings that serve those classrooms, and also a theoretical calculation campus-wide to look at how much office space there was, how much is needed. So again, to take stock, there's almost 1,600 classrooms and teaching labs across all 11 campuses. And then breaking down that, you've got about 40% of those are general classrooms, another 40, a little less than 40% are specialized instructional spaces, teaching labs, and then 20% is dedicated and departmental classrooms. Just a note, it's probably obvious too, the KU leads with a total of 452 total instructional spaces, and K-State has about 388 total instructional spaces. So what we found, and I'm on page 9, what we found from the results of the space utilization study is that all universities were below industry standard target metrics for space utilization. And then also the universities were theoretically, again, we talked about some calculations. There's a variety of methodologies that the consultants use to analyze the space and how it's being used, but based on the theoretical calculations, which are common across higher ed, there was more office space than is technically needed on all the campuses. And so what that rolled up to is we call it opportunity space. There's about 1 million square feet that could easily be used for repurposing in some way. And I'll also just note, I'm doing a summary of the findings. We've got a lot of analysis that we could drill down into, but it would take us down a road that we may not get out of here. So happy to follow up with any questions on that. But so then turning to page 10, the facilities condition assessment. As I pointed out before, previous methods for doing that, limited to just a handful of categories, building systems in a pretty general way, detailed in its own right, but not nearly as granular in detail and in a kind of rigorous analysis of the building components as what we've got with Accruent's team. Their team is made up of architects, engineers, and construction specialists, so they do this every day. And as I said before, 500 buildings logged into the facilities database currently. So that's just under half of the total inventory. And on page 11, I just want to point out another industry standard. So the standard metric for measuring a condition of an existing building is called the Facilities Condition Index, or FCI. And what it really does, you can see there, deferred maintenance that we broke down earlier. Deferred maintenance is the renewal costs associated with resolving deferred maintenance is divided by that current replacement value. So you get a number, a ratio, and so there's various ways to kind of quantify that, qualify it, communicate it. The most practical is that number. You can understand what, the closer to 0 you are, the more perfect condition your building is in. The closer to 1, the worse condition. We can graduate that by looking at the numerals, by talking about descriptive terms: excellent, good, fair, poor, deficient. We can use the letter grades that are kind of useful, that really resonate with us. If you've got an F building, let's say, it really tells you that you've got an issue there, you've got a problem. What are you going to do? I will say this, and it's probably obvious, but it's not just as simple as that. You don't just say, oh, your building's an F, tear it down, right? Because we've got various layers of status that lay over these buildings, right? You could have an F building that's a very important historical building, and it just proves that that's going to be a more complicated calculation to address that. So this gets you to a starting point, and then certain layers of judgment are going to be required to determine what action items need to be implemented to improve those buildings. So on page 12, what we'll see are the results of the Facilities Condition Index in those categories that we introduced earlier, and then see the renewal cost, basically to address the deferred maintenance. I just realized I glossed over one thing, and again, if you're looking at slide 11, you'll see a little blue arrow that says target metric, FCI of 0.1. I will say it's been the board's position in the past to aim for a target that's not mint condition, let's say, and one of the examples that we've used and kind of shared in the offices, like a classic car might be a mint condition. You're taking something that has some age and has some deferred maintenance, so to speak, and you're bringing that thing up to perfect or better than perfect. That's probably not practical with buildings, right? And so what we do is we look at call it a 90% condition target, and that's a good target, reasonable to think that you've revitalized a building to a sufficient condition that it's going to have decades of useful life beyond that. So just wanted to point that out. So back to page 12. So for all the facilities in use, that larger group of inventory of assets, you're looking at an FCI of 0.23 on average across system. And you're looking at the estimated renewal cost to that 90% condition. It's a $1.6 billion total. For that next category of mission critical facilities, 0.27 FCI, renewal cost to 90% condition estimated at $1.3 billion. And then down to that mission critical group that are also EBF eligible, we're looking at an FCI average of 0.32 across system, and then a number that I think most everybody's familiar with now is that $1.2 billion in renewal costs to address the deferred maintenance. So on page 13, what you see, just as an example, are a couple of the analytic mechanisms that we are currently working with Accruent on. All the university's facilities teams, board office, and Accruent are working to configure these analytics within the database so that we can push past that FCI number and layer in all the other factors that need to be considered to make those complicated decisions about what to do with each building. Whether to whether to invest in a building, whether to dispose or replace the building, whether to repurpose it for a, they call it adaptive reuse. It serves this need. Well, maybe it can serve a new need more effectively, or to simply maintain the building. Maintaining a building that's working pretty well for what it's doing, with only nominal investment to get it back up to a good condition that can last long, that's another option. So we're configuring these strategic decision-making tools within the system. We're about halfway through that process and look to wrap that up here in early March. So just to recap, since the board determined that a plan needed to be developed to address deferred maintenance, you can kind of see here on page 14 what's been accomplished. Those 2 studies were completed. The data from those 2 studies were combined into a database for the first time, layering in space and facilities condition. We utilized all of that information to create a consolidated report for facilities. We are continuing to work with the consultant to really leverage the data that is in that database. And looking ahead, we're really probably a few months away from completely developing a facilities renewal deferred maintenance framework that will create a scaffolding of policy that will support what we're looking at as an effective and sustainable plan, so that we can get traction on deferred maintenance and get ahead of it. Essentially, we all know that if we don't want to recreate a wave of resources that address current deficiencies and then fall back in. So with that in mind, the board in the February meeting basically approved a couple of motions to start defining that plan. And one of those motions was to earmark the $10.3 million that the governor's budget included for higher education, earmark that for deferred maintenance. And then the second motion that was approved laid out an initial list of action items that will start to inform that framework, like the framework for facilities renewal. And what we're going to try to achieve here is we're going to work over the next 3 weeks to rigorously study and analyze those action items, with the idea that we're going to have a deferred maintenance summit, including the board and the universities, on the second day of the board meeting in March. So March 18th is the tentative date for that summit. And I think I've stated before, but I mean, the goal of this framework is really to create some policy pieces that were not a part of those previous attempts to solve the deferred maintenance problem. And we think by implementing those right policy pieces, and like I said, it's still a lot of study and analysis to dial that in. But we think taken together, that will create a plan that will be effective and sustainable and ultimately solve the deferred maintenance problem for the universities. So with that, I'd be happy to address some questions.
Okay, wonderful. I wanted to clarify just a couple things. For most of the committee members, y'all are probably aware of this, but hang on. I wanted to make sure you understood, and I think this was in yours. I'm looking for the right second. Okay. Oh yeah, the EBF. So that's a fund that's 1 mil of counties that happens automatically in taxes, and maybe y'all were aware of it. It varies somewhat, right? 20 to 30 million a year, and it's just for higher ed, and it's only those buildings that are instructional. Is that right? And office, or just, ooh, this is loud.
So by so currently we're looking at around the 40 million or so mark. And so by statute, there really are no limitations on how it can be utilized in terms of university projects. I will say though, by board guidance, in practice, there's a very narrow application. And so it's buildings that are mission critical, state-owned facilities constructed before 2007. So that board guidance has focused those resources on a very narrow group of buildings, or the narrowest category that we looked at throughout the presentation, to try to leverage them for the.
Okay, so like on page 5, when you say EBF eligible, you're saying that's the state-owned before 2007, but that's not in statute. That's the board's own guidance.
That's correct, Chair Humphreys.
Okay. Okay, so just to clear that up in case anybody was wondering. And then the one other thing, your building inventory on page 2. So 1,100 facilities, but then most of the rest of your report has to do with, well, starting on page 5, you're talking about square feet. And so I just wanted to point out, or, clarify kind of in my own mind, that some places in the report we're talking about flat out number of buildings, and then sometimes it's square feet. So when you're talking about percentages, just to be aware of what we're talking about.
Yeah, good point. And one thing I would note on that, you start to translate to square feet. I think as the consultants start to dig into calculating those numbers, I mean, they're looking at the granular details. So it starts to go from that big picture, how many facilities do you have, on down to what does each facility have in it, how many square feet, what are the metrics that they start to look at on the building level. So that's one of the reasons you start to shift the focus.
Sure, that makes sense. Okay, so with that, committee, what questions do you have for Chad? Representative Woodard.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a lot of information. I know that you all have been working on this for a very long time, and I know over the summer we heard for the Future of Higher Ed Council, this has been an ongoing project, and I know that it's incredibly important. And I don't know if this is a question for Chad or maybe Blake, but just, I know that deferred maintenance is a huge issue, obviously, over $1 billion in just some of the more mission critical projects. I'm just wondering, the university is already going through incredibly difficult times. Just questioning about maybe the board's conversation about the 10.3 going towards that while they're currently looking at terminating positions and things. The governor's budget, of course, gave you the flexibility to spend it, the board to spend it if that was approved how they want it. And I know the Senate actually took that out. Just wondering how that's the priority over everything else, given all of the tough decisions being made right now, if that was a conversation that the board had.
Sure, I can answer that. I'm getting quite a bit of feedback.
I think.
Can you hear me okay? Or I'll go up here.
Maybe it's easier considering the camera and.
Yeah, so that's a fair conversation. Are you going to value these buildings? Here's what I would tell you. Based on the evidence that we have in terms of the deferred maintenance liability, the building, it is never a good time. I'm not saying this is the best time, but higher ed, as you know, has not enjoyed robust increases over the years. A building does not have a good way to advocate for its maintenance. If you look at just our campuses and based on the evidence. So what the board's saying is we want to earmark these dollars for deferred maintenance because here's what we know. If the money just flows out without any earmark at all, it's likely never going to flow to the maintenance of a building, and we'll just get farther and farther behind. So timing-wise, you know, it wasn't a good time in 2008. It hasn't been a good time all the way through. I would tell you, you know, we don't expect in the next 10 years there to be an ideal time. And so that's how I'd answer that. I think that was kind of the board's thought about that. And so there was a lot of feedback back and forth about, well, should it just backfill operations, or do we try to take a different tack and be strategic with those dollars?
Go
Thank
ahead.
you, Madam Chair. A follow-up to that. So 10.3 million, certainly not 1.2 billion. So how do we address that in the long term?
So I think the board, and Chad could add to this, the board has several policy areas they would like to address. So one of them would be, at the moment, if you bonded the 10.3, you could accelerate some of the deferred maintenance backlog and really address that in a quicker way. There might be, there's discussion around, should we bond right now, because of the rates, some of the EBF proceeds? Because what we know is that with deferred maintenance, it isn't a linear progression getting worse. It's more exponential. So I have to look at my own home. If my window starts leaking, all of a sudden now the entire wall's moldy. Now all of a sudden I've got a bigger problem. And so that's kind of where we are. So there's been that discussion. And then really to look at how do we have a maintenance renewal funds that are actually funded by the university through other sources of funding that say, you know, if you build a building, you're going to have a fund that supports that building over time. And then how are you doing in terms of your space utilization? Okay. And then also, this would be, I want to just set everybody's mind at ease. We're not going after historic buildings. We have some buildings that are old but not antique. And we have some buildings that need to come down to align with what our current enrollments are and what our projected enrollments are. And you in the Capitol know how hard it is to tear down a building, even if it's in a bad state. So I'm not get on a path where we start to take this down.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Representative Wassinger.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On page 12, you have, I'm just trying to understand some of the numbers. The numbers don't add up, and I'm just thinking, and this may be for Chad, sorry, Chad, to make you come back up. I guess it's just me not understanding this page. All facilities in use, estimated renewal cost is 1.6 billion. And then when you split it up, there's 1.3 and 1.2, and that would mean, that would be a lot more. I mean, is that all adding together? It wasn't, because it says all facilities, I would think that would be the biggest number.
Okay.
One of the reasons that 1.6 isn't larger is that all facilities in use is looping in all of the different ownership, we call them ownership codes for buildings, and including lease space, which doesn't currently tally a renewal cost. And so there is a little distortion at that top end. And again, that's kind of why we've been looking at that kind of heart of the group of mission critical EBF eligible buildings. And that's also a point of consistency for the past biennial reports. So there's always been a focus on that mission critical that are EBF eligible. So again, that's why we're focused on that 1.2. But I don't know, does that explain?
That does kind of.
And I think that you have all the facilities, the mission critical, and then within the mission critical, which ones are EBF eligible? So you're not adding those two together.
Right.
Correct.
Is that right? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think I've gotten that. And then I very sadly want to tell you that anytime anyone does something in color at the Capitol, it looks really pretty on the screen, but we can't read it because we have no color printers in the Capitol. So we just get black and white. And so this page, I quick tried to get on it on the screen to see if I could make it bigger. If you could send this to us so we could see what this actually says, that would be really good.
Shirley?
I'd be happy. We have color printers downstairs.
Oh, you do?
If you ever need color printers, just call me.
Oh, wow,
wow.
we're privileged, thank you.
The majority of printers are not color. And then the FCIs, when I look at it, it says they're mostly Bs, correct? I'm sorry, that is, I didn't put the page number on that. 11, sorry. So you're wanting to get them to As, correct? As close as you can? Because that page doesn't say how bad. I guess we're not seeing the really bad ones in that.
Well, if
It's
you,
more of an average, right?
it's a good point that you mentioned averages, and we all know how averages can kind of
Be
skew.
skewed.
Yeah.
Okay.
I will say, if you look at the building inventory, the 2020 report that we've submitted, you will see that a majority of the buildings are in, I'm just going to call it a middle group of condition. I mean, it's somewhat subjective how we scale those ABCDs. I mean, it's kind of a mnemonic device to remember.
Right.
But it's not as critical as that ratio.
Okay.
And so the mathematics of the renewal costs compared to the replacement costs are certainly the primary importance there in that FCI. But I guess I'd just note, and also building on something that Blake highlighted as well, that just because you have buildings that are in that mid-range FCI doesn't mean that you just automatically go on a path to improve those buildings. Because when they overlay with the space utilization and the strategies that we're trying to develop, it may be that a building in that middle condition might be better to take offline, for various reasons. So just want to note that it's kind of the first step towards quantifying the need. It's an insight that's provided by that calculation. But I think taken in total with the strategic frameworks that we're building, it's not always going to be the case that a bad FCI ranking is going to equate to, hey, pour money into that building and make it better.
I have one more question, if I may, Madam Chair. I have deep concern about your space utilization with classrooms, where we're getting a lot of different, I mean, for example, Fort Hayes, their psychology and physics classes are smaller, but critical to get into other farther along parts of the school. You have to have physics to get into the medical research or whatever. I'm just, that's not true. I have no idea whether that's true or not, but I'm just as an example. So I would like to hear how you're going to be looking at that, because there is a deep fear, I think, and concern that some of these schools are, and not all of them, are getting into more detailed degrees and getting rid of some of the, what I call core classes, which makes our students really good citizens. How are you addressing that?
So I wonder if I could, because I do
Of course,
wonder if that's
please.
a programs issue there as well.
You're just the number guy.
So to clarify, you're talking programs, but also classroom space, buildings and programs. Okay.
Yeah, so as you can imagine, when space utilization numbers come out and they don't, and it shows that we're not using our space as well as we could, that generates a lot of concern on the campuses. And you think about that, we have targets where we would like those to be, it's not 100%. So you're going to have some classes that are smaller. You know, as an example with office space, okay, it shows that we got too much office space for the number of employees. Well, sometimes you're in an older building, maybe the standard for office space is 10 by 12. But every building in that, or every office in that building was 10 by 20. So really you have filled them all. So there's nuance like that throughout the study. It's not just totally hard and fast. What I would say is when you roll all the numbers up, I think it does show targets that we need to strive toward, knowing that we're going to have some of those classes that are smaller.
Okay, thank you. I just really want to know that my, you know, my grandchildren, when I get them to go to college, they get those core classes, and I hate to see some of them programs gotten done away with. So I'm glad to hear that you're paying attention to that as well.
We are going to do our best to protect those core classes. We're going to protect those mission critical courses. Here's what I would say. I believe, well, I know we're going to have fewer programs. Our footprint is going to shrink just based on budgets.
Yeah.
You know, we're not going to be able to be all things to all people. So we're really going through a lot of storming at the board office and at the institutions to say which ones are critical for our communities, critical for our state to keep, which ones do we need to just look at further that don't have as much interest. And I have to tell you, those are hard conversations to have. And it's going to be some very difficult decisions. We're put in that place, though, because we can't continue to just cut everyone 4% across the board, 8% every year. So at some point, you have to say, well, we're going to have to reduce the size of our footprint.
Okay, and then I have a question, and I sent this to our analyst. One of the members of the Board of Regents said that there is actually a statute that, did you pull it out? You have it. Go ahead. Yes. Oh, no, you go ahead. That's great. Thank you.
I was going to ask the same question. So I'm sure you're familiar with 76-790, the privately financed buildings maintenance costs. So it's a statute, and Barb mentioned it, or Representative Wassinger mentioned it often when we were having our reports from the universities. And so I think, well, what's your question? Go ahead. I have a question, but I bet it's the same. You go ahead. Basically, it says if it's privately owned businesses, then there has to be some sort of fund set aside for the maintenance privately. Is that?
So I think I know which statute you're referring to. And I have to tell you, you've kind of hit me cold, so I don't memorize the statutes. But I do think it might generally say that if 51% of the proceeds were private that built the facility, then the university cannot ask for additional state general fund, cannot ask for additional state general fund for maintenance of that building. So I think we have to go back just back a few legislative sessions, actually probably before I was even in Topeka, quite a long time ago, where universities actually built the facilities, people and foundations raised the money for those facilities, and then they were a gift to the state. And what the state would do at that time is say, well, for that gift to the state, we're going to add to your base budget. We would come in and request what maintenance needs were for that building, and that would be actually added to the state general fund. I don't ever remember that happening, but I guess at one time, our budget, our CFO, Elaine Frisbee, said that actually would happen. That's what so finally the legislature said, we're not going to add that money anymore. If you keep building buildings, don't come back and ask us for additional state general fund. I think where there's confusion is that many policymakers and some legislators took that to mean you're going to have a segregated fund. You're at the university for the maintenance of that facility. In some cases, that is true. There's a student fee that maintains the facility, or there's actually a fund that maintains the facility. In other cases, as an example, Fort Hays State University doesn't have any debt on any buildings, except for just a little bit on a couple new ones. So they would say, well, we'll just take it out of general proceeds. Not having a dedicated fund for that building, but just pledge that support when they built the building. So that's, I think, a little bit of the, I can dig deeper into that statute with our attorneys and everything, but that's generally, I think, what we're talking about.
That's exactly the statute. And it basically says that each state educational institution shall provide for the future annual maintenance and operation costs for an improvement of buildings, which 51% of the cost is financed with private monies. But then in section C says each state educational institution shall submit to the state board a plan to provide for the annual maintenance and operation costs of an improvement when seeking approval for the making of such improvement from the state board. So I guess the question is, are they doing this? And, do you feel like, are you satisfied that the statute's being followed?
I'm satisfied that the statute's being followed. Are the plans as overt as they need to be? No. Sometimes the plan is we will dedicate the support from our operational dollars. I think if you look at the board's desire with maintenance assessment and long-term, the board's desire is to take a deeper look into those plans and require a more robust plan on those facilities.
Mm-hmm. And I said 2019, but that's not, it was 2007 is when it happened, yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, maybe a few more questions. Representative Riley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think to some extent you just covered some of the question that I had. I mean, what came up earlier was that we voted through some legislation this morning having to do with giving some lottery funds to engineering, that kind of thing. So there are very, very small amounts sometimes that come to help pay off bond issues, correct? And in addition to that, you have people that are alumni people that come and give millions of dollars for a new building, but they're not going to spend millions and millions of dollars to change an old building to to an old building to get it in their name, to just bring it up to snuff. That doesn't happen very often, correct?
Well, there's people here that know the foundation business better than I do, but generally people want, if they're going to give a large gift, they want to have a building, maybe a naming opportunity. We don't have a lot of people that want to replace a boiler. We'll put your name on that, but it's just not something that's been very attractive to donors. So that's always kind of like, well, why can't you get donations to do the deferred maintenance? And I'll tell you, that's not going to happen. That's why the board has said, we need to take a different tack here. We need to, we haven't been able to do anything without your partnership, but we also we want to take more responsibility for it.
Kind of along those lines, I'm curious, so I think some of us at least have seen the motion last week at your board meeting. And so do you, and the first one was about the 10.3 million that Representative Woodard asked about. And then the second one really is about asking the board to consider a framework and come back with some ideas and thoughts. So would you speak to that just a little bit? How do you feel about that? How that sort of intersects with these statutes and the bonding, maybe issue? If you could just elaborate, would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, and Chad will certainly give me the hook if I get too far off base and would have more information. So those motions were put out by the board, and I think in those categories that can set us on a trajectory to fix the issue. And again, we're not going to come back here in 3 years and say, well, now we've got the deferred maintenance. It's $1.2 billion. It's just getting on the right kind of trajectory. So, and other things that would help as we look. So we had a formula, like on the EBF. In a proviso, I believe you put a formula on that says, well, we have this formula in the campus. So here's what that does inadvertently. So I have these EBF buildings. 3 of them need torn down. If I tear those down, my square footage is going down. Right? They're gone. Now I've lost money in the formula because I reduced my square footage. So we're looking at all those types of things. We've actually got some disincentives in the system that we need to correct. And I think the institutions on those are easier, you know, to say, hey, let's figure out a way where that doesn't penalize you. You know, because what we want is we want institutions leading there. They're on the ground. They can make those decisions. We're really going to be, for a little while, I guess, norming, storming, performing. We're going to be in the storming phase, okay? So there's a lot of discussion going on in the system. These motions that were passed by the board said, here's our idea for a certain area. You come back with maybe even a better idea, but we're going to address these areas and get policy around, you know, a maintenance assessment long-term. How do we have more of an overt plan for these buildings 2007 and beyond? You know, the board, not actually this body, but the board said a long time ago on the Educational Building Fund, I know that it says you can use it for anything. Hold it. We're narrowing it because we knew it wasn't enough dollars. So you had to say, okay, what are the really critical academic buildings, and you can just use it for that. So I think the board's already taken some important steps. We just want to get more aggressive and go further yet.
Thank you. That's helpful. And I'm glad you kind of addressed that larger footprint, made the formula a little bit more attractive to people and smaller, or universities, and then smaller footprint less. So thank you for addressing that, because I kind of wanted to ask a question about that too. So, okay. And then one last question I have, and committee, feel free to ask more. We have a little bit more time. Would you say that the plan is to do the deferred maintenance and annual maintenance, what Chad mentioned, you know, it's kind of all rolled into one? I mean, we're not going to forget the annual maintenance just because we're working so hard on the deferred maintenance. So
if you miss an annual maintenance, it becomes deferred.
Yes, exactly. That was my question. What's the definition? Like, is it 1 year? Should have done it last year, so is it now deferred? I mean, what's... Okay, committee, what other? This is a great opportunity. Representative Rajas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I made a few notes. Imagine that. I don't know who wants to answer this. These are simple questions, I think, but just for a better understanding of, you know, we talk about all the different levels of buildings. So this may be a little rapid fire, and I don't necessarily need long explanations, but I'm afraid a couple of them might be. But I do have a list you can take back to the regents for a facility to take offline. Based on what's going on this year, I think Allen Fieldhouse could be taken off. It's a joke. Don't text me. And the way the other schools played, Bramlage could probably go offline as well. Who's that? Yeah, I know. It'll hold a lot of corn. That's all I know. But let's talk about that, because as you gave all these numbers, it's an awful lot of numbers for us to go over. But like an Allen Fieldhouse, because athletics in most of our institutions, I think these bigger ones, they kind of have their own corporation. So I guess who pays the light bill at Allen Fieldhouse? Because I know they've raised money to do some things to, you know, upgrade the restrooms and other things over the last few years, make it ADA compliant. Is that a cost share, or how does that work, since it is on campus, but is it considered one of those buildings that's owned by the university, by the state?
Yeah, if I can. I don't know the answer to all those questions, but I can certainly follow that.
Well, I'm just curious,
I mean, operating costs and all that, I'd have.
I know like at Emporia, White, I assume that's a lease because that's not part of the university, but I'm just kind of curious as we look at, I don't know which one is in Pittsburgh, but, and Gross Coliseum and Hayes and so on, just how that, because when we look, I mean, obviously, I think people would be maybe more inclined to give more money to facilities like that than maybe some of the other ones. So kind of to parlay off that, like the alumni buildings, like the one, is it Williams Center, is that right? Or is it, where do you, I mean, you're Foundation or alumni? Foundation? Well, the alumni building, I believe, is still on campus, and the alumni building at K-State's on campus. But are those K-State buildings, or are those on there through an arrangement? Again, are all the bills paid for by the alumni?
So again, the question about the bills being paid, so those are state-owned buildings. There's different processes for how they're funded up until the point they're constructed and the certificate of occupancy is complete. So those are, and back to your first question.
Sure.
Still state-owned buildings, different funding mechanisms. So at the inception of the project idea, there's some differences there, statutory differences and how they're funded. How they're maintained and operated and how those bills get paid moving forward, I would have to follow up with more information on that.
'Cause I guess,
I think maybe Elaine, does Elaine have I see that she.
sure.
Elaine, I'm assuming you put on your camera because you were raising your hand or, yeah.
Yes.
Would you like to answer that question for Representative Rajas?
I would, if I may, Madam Chair. This is Elaine for Finance Administration at the Board of Regents. And when you are thinking about our KU endowment, our K-Station, K-State Athletics, or KU Athletics, those are affiliated corporations. So they are separate legal entities aside from the university as a state agency, and they pay for their own facilities and their own maintenance of their buildings and to operate and run those buildings.
Okay. All right. And I may need you to, Elaine, if that's all right. Ms. Madam Chair. Okay, I'm looking at an example. We talked about this statute and maintenance and so on. I'm thinking of Derland Hall at K-State, the engineering. It got started before I started college. And over time, I think there's now 4 phases, maybe 5, of Derland. So it started, I believe, in 81, maybe when it first went online, 87, I think. Not, anyway, so help me understand that because it's kind of gone over that time frame. So I don't know who can maybe answer that or am I trying to make something that is not an issue?
Representative Rajas, if I may.
I'm sorry to make such a hard question, but I'm sure that's not the only one on our campuses.
Just trying to make sure I understand. So you're saying that facility where it was originally constructed at a certain date, but
over time, over the last couple of decades, they've added new phases, in a sense, to the original, so does it default back to the original time it went online or occupied, if you will?
These are good questions, and I think it falls into the category of these judgment calls. I mean, there's other buildings that fall into this too, right? If you have a significant structure added on to another facility, let's say, it seems, one way of looking at it is it seems unfair to say that addition would negate any investment in that other structure, especially if it's a significant size too, right? I mean, so if you had, because you can add on to a building with doing very little to the other buildings you're adding on to, right? So I would answer that to say that I think it requires some judgment in terms of what's reasonable.
Okay. A couple more, I'm sorry, but I made some, I'm actually paying attention today, so, okay. And again, it's kind of more for all our understanding as well. Okay, I'm not picking on KU, but the Kansas Union, they did a huge reboot in a sense. So is that now based still on the original date that the union was first constructed, or because there was such a significant, not only just facelift, but internally, what, a decade ago or so? Or again, is that judgment? I don't want to get into the weeds, but I kind of do. So because there's so many different facets to all these.
Chair Humphreys, if I could, I think again, I'll generalize because I don't know all the details on the union and what, but let's just assume hypothetically that a building had a major comprehensive renovation, right? It was renewed up to an A grade, at the risk of using the A's and B's and all that again, but it was brought up to current standards. I think that is reasonable to say that the date resets on a project like that. Again, not specifically talking.
Right, and as we go on, we can. One more, Madam Chair. Okay, sure.
So sometimes it depends on the campus. So at the University of Kansas Student Union, if it's a controlled corporation that's separate, it might be maintained by student fees.
So it could be a completely separate.
Yes.
Sure.
And unions, a lot of times, the pattern has been that model. Not everywhere. You know, it's just like it's how athletics differ a little bit. At the very large universities, at University of Kansas, Kansas State, that are in Power 5 conferences, they're separate corporations. At a smaller place, you know what? There might be some cross subsidy.
Okay. I guess I haven't thought about the union being a kind of a separate thing to itself. Okay. Last call, and maybe we don't know there yet, and this may be for you, Blake. You know, I know like Fort Hayes, which, you know, I represent a part of it with Representative Wassinger. Low debt, fairly new buildings, or those buildings that weren't have been upgraded pretty strong over the last couple of decades. Maybe their needs are going to be different, say, than one of our older campuses. Will each university be treated, that's maybe the wrong word to treated, but will they be able to come with their list, and then I guess could every university get something in this process, or will you define, say, a top, whatever, 2 or 5 for the system, and then that's what will happen? Have you got that far?
Yeah, so here's what I don't see happening. I don't see the board saying all of the money's going to K-State and KU. If the board did that, this body would correct that. So that isn't going to happen. So what we're hopeful of is these data will inform the campuses in a better way on which buildings need the work and need to be, and where that deferred maintenance needs to be addressed. You know, obviously the needs are going to be different on every campus. We've talked about you can't penalize a campus that's kept up, you know. But I would say even if a campus has, it might mean they have less deferred maintenance, but they're still going to have, you know, there's still a large entity that's going to have ongoing maintenance and a deferred maintenance. If you look as an example at Fort Hayes, you know, Gross Memorial Coliseum, you know, there's going to come a time there's going to be some maintenance there. You know, not that they're not doing maintenance now, but, you know, it's, you know, as those buildings age, they just require additional maintenance. So, you know, they'll be, I know the CFO there, you'll be setting aside resource, getting ready for that, and usually using the appropriate funding streams.
All right. That's my questions. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Amix.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a question, and I don't know who this would go to. The EBF, when was it established?
It was 1942.
And how many times has it been upgraded? Any idea, or reviewed or anything? No, ma'am, I just thought about it.
I'll let Shirley answer that one.
Let me pull up my spreadsheet here.
Okay. It's
The bill actually was in 1941. The expenditure started in 1942. I've had a little research project over the last few days. I have every appropriation since 1942 out of the EBF and every change to the mill levy. In 1942, the mill levy for the Educational Building Fund started at 0.25, so a quarter of a mill. This is a big spreadsheet. So in 1949, it was increased to 0.75. In 1955, 3/4 of one mill levy was for the Educational Building Fund, and they created a state school dormitory fund and used a quarter of the mill for that. In 1961, it went up to 1.75 mil. 1.5 of that went to the EBF, and 1/7 went to the state school dormitory fund, and the remainder went to state general fund. In 1966, 3/4 of 1 mil went to EBF, and 1/4 went to the state school dormitory fund.
Continue, or?
Just go to the most recent.
Well, you're no fun.
I'm impressed.
Yeah,
No.
yeah.
The most recent change from the current 1 mil where we are now is 2003. They put 0.6 of the 1 mil toward the Educational Building Fund and 0.3 to the State Institutions Building Fund. And it's been 1 mil ever since.
And the state institutions building fund is $500,000 now, right? And it's the state hospital and the school of the blind and deaf. And, okay, did that answer your question? It did. Okay. Okay.
Actually, since you mentioned the blind and the deaf,
Yes.
they actually started out with EBF. They got quite a bit of that money back in the 40s and 50s. And then when SIBF was created, they were switched over to that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, any other questions, committee? Okay, my last, Representative Riley.
Yes, Madam Chair. I would propose that Shirley write a book.
Someday maybe she will. We keep her too busy now, but maybe someday. Okay, my last question to you, Blake, is so what would you like us to do? What can we do? You know, this statute that we talked about maybe needs some tweaks. You know, what would you like us to do or not?
Yeah, so what I'd like to do is hold our summit in the middle of March. I'm not prepared today to have an ask and come back and say, okay, out of that, here's some items. I don't know if that proviso with the formula is still on. I'm looking at Elaine, it is, so that probably needs to come off. There needs to be, I want institutions to be comfortable about that. But if we could, we'd like to more or less set those amounts so that people don't have a disincentive to tear down structures. Mm-hmm. So that'd be, we will send you in writing some things early on and then more after the summit.
Okay, perfect. That's just what we needed. Okay, committee, anything else for the good of the committee? Okay, we're adjourned.